So welcome to the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research hosted session this afternoon. My name is Niall Hamilton-Smith. I'm one of the academics at the University of Stirling, but our main speaker today is obviously Konstantinos, Dr. Gaitis, who is going to talk to us about his Scottish Justice Fellowship project and the sort of the ramifications of the findings in relation to sort of his exploration of human trafficking and the sort of legal and policy frameworks. So really nice to see everybody today. This session is going to last for about an hour. Konstantinos is going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then we will have an opportunity, hopefully, or 35 to 40, and then there'll be hopefully lots of opportunity for discussion and reflection. The sessions afterwards are sort of archived on the sort of Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research YouTube site. So if people wish to catch up on it later, or if there are colleagues who couldn't make it, as often is the case on these sorts of Friday sessions, then obviously you can pass on the link or let them know that it's available on the SCCJR website. So just to give a tiny bit of context of 30 seconds, as I say, this came out of a scheme called the Scottish Justice Fellowships, which is a scheme that was periodically runs and is sort of sponsored by the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research, the Scottish Institute for Policing Research, and by the Scottish Government and colleagues, particularly in Justice Analytical Services. And the idea of the scheme, to some extent, is to take PhD work, and in this case, the PhD of Konstantinos, which he completed at the University of Edinburgh a few years back, and really try and create a space for translating that work into an output that is amenable for or useful for policy and practitioners to some extent. And I think what's quite nice about this is, as academics, we often produce evaluative work we're formally commissioned to produce evaluative work for government, or we might produce descriptive or numerative work. Creating a space for, however, an output that captures often what PhDs entail, which is less narrowly evaluative or descriptive. It's often really dealing with quite sort of complex normative, often quite complex interdisciplinary work, looking at, in this case, at sort of policy and practice frameworks and discourse and the sort of complexity of real life practice. It's a real challenge, and it was a real challenge through this project, and a really interesting challenge to try and produce a product that captures a really complex investigation of how human trafficking is understood in a sort of socio-legal policy, legal frameworks, and so on, and trying to sort of produce something that will help people reflect on their practice and their sort of policy making. So it was a really enjoyable challenge to be involved in. I was sort of one of Konstantinos' two mentors. We have an academic mentor, and then we had Una Fraser, who was very kindly was the sort of Scottish government mentor. And it was an interesting process, but hopefully produces something, as I say, which really captures some of the complexity of this area and allows us to have a slightly more nuanced discussion about what we're trying to do. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Konstantinos, who is still at the University of Edinburgh as a research fellow. I won't go into his detailed bio here. You can find it in the sort of the background material, and he's going to take us through some of the sort of key implications of his work and the sorts of thoughts it promotes. So Konstantinos, over to you. Do you want to introduce yourself and share some slides?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thanks so much to everyone who's here and attending this webinar. Thanks to Julie for dropping the idea of organizing that, and obviously Rachel, who made this happen. And thanks to Niall, of course, for chairing the event. And yeah, for all the kind words and the great intro. Yeah, so I'll just kick off by sharing my slides first, and we'll walk it through from there. So I believe you're able to see my slides.
Yeah, they're up.
Let me just put that on full screen. Great. So as Niall said, yeah, this presentation is basically, this webinar is basically emanating from my thesis that I conducted between 2017 and 2021 at the University of Edinburgh. I see one of my two supervisors being here, Steve Kirkwood. So hi to Steve. Yeah, it was on how human trafficking is regulated in the UK. And then from that one, And under the auspices of the Scottish Justice Fellowship scheme that came subsequently, I produced a policy brief of about 10 pages summarizing, let's say, the key messages of that thesis, and in a more sort of policy-oriented and policy-making-oriented way. Yeah, if you want to read more about that Scottish Justice Fellowship policy brief, you can feel free to scan the QR code, which is found at the bottom right of this slide. And if you don't have the time to do that now, for some reason that fails, you can always have a second opportunity at the very last slide for another QR code taking you to the same page. So in that page, you'll be able to find the policy brief. And if you scroll a bit further down to that same page, you'll find a podcast episode, which is recorded, I think, last July 23, with Bronna Andrew from TARA, Trafficking Awareness Raising Alliance, the NGO that's contracted by the Scottish government to support adult women trafficked for prostitution in Scotland. And then Jackie Murray, who's from Police Scotland. So the three of us had a discussion of about 1 hour and 20 minutes to 1 hour and 30 minutes. I think we went to Joe Rogan sort of lengths of podcast there a bit. But it's an interesting discussion, and I hope it's easy to follow and easy to listen. And yeah. So as Niall said, I finished my PhD at the University of Edinburgh. I still work at the University of Edinburgh as a research fellow at Child Light Institute. And yeah, without further ado, I might as well just kick off and just providing a brief summary of what we're going to talk today. So this is a critical examination of the UK's anti-trafficking regulatory framework, concentrating both on the reserved and the devolved level. And I'm going to focus specifically on the National Referral Mechanism, the NRM, which is the main system used across the UK to deal with trafficking cases and trafficking victims. So it's a UK-wide mechanism that operates a bit differently through devolved legislations, let's say. My methods, as I will say further later in this presentation, were legislative analysis, policy-based analysis, and qualitative interviews. Briefly, some of the findings is that the policy-based discourse across the UK is still characterized by numerous stereotypes for trafficking. The professional backgrounds of the people that I interviewed, the professionals that I interviewed, was highly influential in shaping stakeholders' views of human trafficking. I did find gaps in first responder skills and in broader trafficking awareness. There's a fragmented approach taken across the UK with regards to human trafficking that is often caused and reinforced by devolution. And then I'm going to also touch upon the debate on the need for a friendlier or stricter immigration policy. So what is human trafficking? Every piece of national legislation has a definition of human trafficking, and more or less those definitions are the same with some minor differences. You can see that, for example, if you compare the Westminster Act, the Modern Slavery Act, and the Scottish, let's say, Human Trafficking Act. However, the main piece of legislation and the main definition to which all those national pieces of legislation are based on to provide their own definitions is the UN's Palermo Protocol, which for adult victims specifically states that human trafficking is composed of 3 elements. So we have the act, which is recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of people. We have the means, which is threats, force, coercion, abduction, fraud, deception, abuse of power, or vulnerabilities. And I believe that this last element here, the abuse of power, vulnerabilities, is quite central, exactly because this is the one of the 2 aspects that widens the trafficking definition to an awesome level, because abuse of power, vulnerabilities is such a wide-ranging and encompassing concept that can fit a lot of cases under its wing. And finally, we have the purpose of exploitation. So sexual or labor exploitation, domestic servitude, or organs harvesting. It's worth mentioning that for human trafficking offense to be completed, this exploitation doesn't need to take place. You just need to have the offender having that purpose of exploitation when they're committing the act through one of those means. So as I said before, abuse of power, vulnerabilities is one of the 2 aspects that's making human trafficking and the human trafficking definition really wide-ranging. The other aspect is the fact that lack of consent is not mentioned as a condition in the definition. So to be a victim of human trafficking, you don't need to lack suspicion or consent or even prior knowledge of what's going on, as long as you come from a background of vulnerabilities. So as I said in my thesis, the only case in which, technically speaking, you wouldn't be a human trafficking victim would be if you consented and if you didn't come from a background of vulnerabilities and if there was no abuse of power taking place. Because in this case, the consent would be considered full and free. In any other case, that consent is actually considered skewed and tainted. So it doesn't really count, if that makes sense. So as I said in my thesis, again, it's quite hard not to be labeled as a human trafficking victim. And having discussed that, for instance, with Brona expressed some questions around human trafficking is sort of consuming consenting prostitution. And as she wondered in one of the discussions that we had is, where is prostitution? It's being substituted increasingly by human trafficking. So that's an interesting take, and it's worth further researching, I think, the relationship between human trafficking and prostitution as a concept. It's worth mentioning that this is the definition for human trafficking for adult victims, and my thesis was based on that. When it comes to children victims, you don't need to consider the means at all. You just have the act and the purpose of exploitation. So it's a much more stripped down, let's say, definition of human trafficking for child victims. Now, the profiles of victims and traffickers. According to literature, there's a wide range of profiles for both victims and traffickers. You have traffickers who may range from organized crime rings, as we know them, to opportunistic. It could be family, friends, unaware recruiters, partners. And of course, in the middle, you have a whole range, a whole spectrum of traffickers with varying levels of organization. Then when it comes to victims, again, we have victims who did not know, suspect, or consent to anything, to victims that were fully knowledgeable, suspicious, or might even actually have agreed to some sort of exploitation. But as we said before, because they come from a background of vulnerabilities, or there's some abuse of power taking place, or an extension of that exploitation that was agreed, these people are still victims. And obviously, we have a spectrum of cases lying in the middle between these two extremes. Now, when it comes to the UK introduced the National Referral Mechanism in 2009, and that was based on the model provided by the Organization for the Security and Cooperation in Europe. As I said before in the beginning of this webinar, the NRM is a UK-wide mechanism, but the sort of intriguing part is that it operates through through devolved legislative frameworks. Obviously, in Scotland, for example, we have a devolved care system, a devolved criminal justice system, a devolved policing and law enforcement system, and a devolved health system. And therefore, the NRM is a UK mechanism. However, it does operate through all those devolved pieces of legislation. New anti-slavery and anti-trafficking, both reserved and devolved legislation, was adopted. All of these three pieces were adopted in 2015. So we have a UK Modern Slavery Act, we have a Human Trafficking and Exploitation Scotland and Northern Ireland Act, and all of them were enacted in 2015 with some differences and some converging points. The NRM referrals have, I would say, skyrocketed from 2013 all the way to 2022. And please bear in mind that because the policy brief was published at the end of 23, I didn't include the 2023 statistics, which were issued somewhere in the beginning of 24. However, if you look at the 2024 statistics, they look like the number of referrals, the 2023 statistics that were issued early this year, the referrals seem to have plateaued, if that makes sense. They seem to be around the same ballpark as the 2022 numbers. I believe there's only an increase of about 100 cases more referred in 23 compared to 22. So the number is pretty much the same. As you see, there's a steep rise from 23 to 22, which is a 10-year, let's say, mark. Now, whether that rise in NRM referrals is because there's more trafficking going on in the UK, or because we are more aware of that, we have invested more powers and budget, and we have raised awareness in the UK, that is up for discussion. And I don't think anybody can safely answer that it's one or the other. More likely, it's a bit of both. And that's what pretty much my interviews also revealed, that we cannot speak definitively about a rise in trafficking, but we cannot exclude that. And also the fact that we are investing more money and more attention to that, that has played a role as well. When it comes to the gender of referral potential victims, I think that's a very interesting graph. So when we think of human trafficking, we tend to think of films like Taken or Rambo: Last Blood, for those of you who are, like myself, Sylvester Stallone connoisseurs. It's more about prostitution of adult women. That's how we think that, forced prostitution or prostitution under deception of adult women. However, in the UK, things are a bit different. We have more male victims than female. From 2017 onwards, the numbers, as you can see, have flipped, and we have more referrals of potential male victims than female. That obviously corresponds to more cases of labor exploitation compared to sexual exploitation, because men are more trafficked for labor rather than prostitution, and usually females, usually women, are trafficked for prostitution, for sexual exploitation, rather than so much for labor exploitation. Why that's the case, I'm not too sure. It could show that that the human trafficking in the UK is unfolding differently than the rest of the world, or it shows that the UK is actually doing a very good job at breaking stereotypes. Again, we're not sure. It's not surprising that we have many male victims of trafficking. Even if you look globally, labor exploitation, labor trafficking exploitation is on the rise and constitutes a big chunk of all trafficking cases processed through criminal justice systems across the globe. It's just staggering that in the UK, and even if you look at 2023 numbers, 3 out of 4 victims are male, 1 out of 4 potential victims, to be precise, referred potential victims, are female. Again, I think that merits more research, and correspondingly, what also merits more research is female perpetration of human trafficking, which is not, I've not included that in the graph, but I can tell you that according to the UN, about 35 to 40% of offenders globally, offenders who were either arrested, prosecuted, or convicted, are women, are female. And that is a quite high number. If you compare that to general female offending rates, it's a very high number. Now, some say, and that is correct, that a lot of those women were victims prior to becoming offenders themselves, and either because they wanted to escape victimization, they normalized what's happening, or they sort of got desensitized to this whole experience and they wanted to commit an offense as well because they just wanted to climb up the ladder. For all sorts of reasons, a lot of those women passed through from one identity to the other, or they might actually share both identities at the same time. What the UN says, and I think it's quite interesting, is that for a lot of those female offenders, their first time involvement with human trafficking was as offenders. And I think that this is really interesting as well, that they were not victims beforehand, but they were actually offenders to begin with. And definitely female perpetration of human trafficking and modern slavery offenses, I think that merits a lot more research attention. Now, going back to my research though, my main question was, how is human trafficking regulated in the UK? And I subdivided that to 3 questions. So how are victims and traffickers viewed in official discourse across the UK? Then what's the anti-trafficking approach taken across the UK? And thirdly, how are the rights and the needs of victims dealt with in the UK? Now, my methods for that, as I said in the beginning briefly, was discourse analysis of anti-trafficking policies issued by the UK and the Scottish and Northern Irish governments between 2015 and 2019. And then qualitative interviews with 23 practitioners. And unfortunately, I tried my best to find people from Wales and Northern Ireland. I couldn't find any. So all of the interviews happened with people from England and Scotland. I also did what I call an interview by proxy with a domestic female victim trafficked for prostitution in England. She was trafficked for 10 years since the age of 13. So she's what we call a historic case of trafficking. And I used the alias Eve to describe her. So when I say interview by proxy, what I mean is that the interview was not conducted by me, even though that was the original plan. And the reason for that was because of classing commitments, and we couldn't find sort of dates that would be suitable for both myself and Eve. And out of fear of losing Eve as an interviewee, despite the fact that she was quite eager to be interviewed, we were still quite wary that we actually might lose her as an interviewee. So we decided to proceed with an interview by proxy. That proxy interviewer was a caseworker, a former caseworker of Eve, with whom Eve had a relationship of mutual safety and trust. So I sent my questions to the caseworker asked those questions. They also asked questions of their own, which were really, really good questions. And therefore, we had about 1 hour interview with Eve. Now, all interviews were conducted between 2018 and 2019. So briefly, some of the findings here. So the policy-based representations for victims and traffickers, what I found was that the dominant narrative of anti-trafficking policies across the UK, both reserved and devolved policies, revolves around narrow stereotypes. We have the ideal, innocent, passive, heavily traumatized victim that never knew, never consented to anything, never suspected to anything. That was the predominant sort of image going on. And the same stereotypes were sort of perpetuated for traffickers as well. They were depicted as the evil, mostly organized perpetrators. There was not enough mentioning, let's say, of other sort of profiles of traffickers, less organized or even completely non-organized. That said, UK government policies are slowly but increasingly recognizing the existence of a spectrum for both victims and traffickers. They were found to be doing a much better job at sort of denoting those spectrums compared to policies of the Scottish and Northern Irish governments. Of course, as I said before, this is research that's been done at the late, up until late 2019. So it's worth replicating that or continuing that for the 2020s. The anti-trafficking approach across the UK, when someone is studying anything across the UK, the thing that always comes up is the divide between England and Scotland. So what the interview findings evidenced here was the fragmentation in the NRM's operation, what we call the postcode lottery support experience for victims. You get a very different experience as a victim of the same exploitation, same type of exploitation, if you're found in one part of England to another, or even to Scotland, one part of Scotland to another. And obviously the divide exists between nations as well. As I said, as one of my interviewees said, you get a very different experience if you're found in rural Kent compared to Glasgow, for instance, or even if you're identified in northern Scotland compared to Glasgow. Again, the experience can be very different in the sense that irrespective of what type of exploitation you endured, if your area will have a designated number of services and organizations that may or may not be suitable to you. The discrepancy here and the divide was very, very prominent between Scotland and England. So devolution in key areas, as I said before, law enforcement and criminal justice system, policing, care, health systems, devolution in key areas, combined with the deep-rooted ideological differences between the UK and the Scottish government, have caused and reinforced this fragmentation. It's the same mechanism, but it works through different policing bodies, and it works through different care systems, and it works through different justice systems. The Scottish government, if we were to compare the governments, the Scottish government was found to be following a more pro-victims and rights needs approach. On the other hand, the UK government was found to be balancing between we need to satisfy referred individuals' rights and needs, but we also need to maintain borders and a stricter migration and a stricter fiscal policy. Now, as one of my interviewees from Scotland said, it's not like the Scottish government are angels themselves, but they are definitely much more pro-victims' rights. However, I think that it's not that simple. In a way, as I said in my thesis, and I still believe, I think the Scottish government, in a way, can afford to be the good guy here. They can afford to be nicer and look nicer. Why? Because the Scottish government doesn't have borders to regulate. They don't have borders and immigration under their wing as the UK government does. So in a way, the UK government might appear like the bad guy, or more accurately, the pragmatic guy, but they have to, exactly because they have borders under their wing. And I hypothesize or estimate, if you will, that if Scotland were ever to be independent, then maybe the Scottish government approach would actually come closer to the existing UK government approach, rather than continue on the same pathway that the Scottish government is right now. Then when it comes to the converging points, what I found was the converging point between all three governments that I examined their policies, UK, Scottish, and Northern Irish governments, is punitiveness against traffickers, which is embodied in the noble yet superfluously impressive goal of total trafficking elimination. I mean, personally, I'm not so much against being punitive against traffickers. At the end of the day, you've committed an offense. It's usually quite a horrible offense. And I know that structures play a role in criminality, but so does choice. However, what I did take offense with is the goal of total trafficking elimination. I believe that this is highly unrealistic. And in a way, have we ever eliminated any form of crime, and especially human trafficking, which sort of has been going on in the form of maybe slavery in older eras, and nowadays it's called modern slavery or human trafficking, but it has always been going on. It has always been closely connected to the history of mankind, let's say. The same thing goes for murders or robberies or any other offense that we can think of. Have we ever eliminated those? Well, no. So as I don't want to get too theoretical, because this is not my goal at all, but I mean, Durkheim did say that crime is a normal social fact. Why? Exactly because it's been forever taking place, it's been forever happening, and it will forever happen. So I did take offense with the goal of total trafficking elimination. And someone could ask, and they would be right to ask that, then what are you expecting policies to say? That we will just try to make things a bit better? It doesn't stick well together. It doesn't resonate well with people. And I mean, voters. Total elimination sounds catchier. Well, sure, it does. But what you're doing is you're setting the bar unrealistically high, and you're always going to fall right below that. You're never going to succeed. And elimination seems to be a goal that's been set in several pieces of official discourse. I remember the New Labour in the 90s wanted to eliminate child poverty. In the beginning of the COVID pandemic years, a lot of people were talking about eliminating COVID, stamping out, which is a very interesting phrase because they use the same phrase for human trafficking, stamping out COVID, stamping out human trafficking. So the problem with unrealistic goals like total elimination is that they sort of hide other intentions. In my opinion, they hide intentions for government overreach in society. What they're trying to do is extend the arm of the government and engineer societies in unprecedented ways. Because when you set the bar unrealistically high and you fail, what you are going to do as a remedy is increase the measures you're going to take, increase how restrictive you're going to be, increase how strict you're going to be against the problem and how seriously you're going to take it. So in a way, elimination is, in my opinion, a mode, a way, a method to sort of intervene more, increase your powers, increase your criminal justice powers, and regulate even harder. And that's the reason I think why I took quite an offense with that. Moving on to professional backgrounds and how influential they were in interviewees' opinions. So I interviewed a range of professionals, politicians, policymakers, government officials, law enforcement interviewees, people from the Serious Organized Crime and Crime Agency, which is now defunct, as I understand, GLA, which is the Gang Masters Labor Abuse Authority. I interviewed a range of NGOs, which mostly are active in anti-trafficking efforts. The big divide here was between law enforcement interviewees and NGO interviewees. So officers and people like the person who was working for Gang Masters Labor Abuse Authority or the person who was working for SOCA, they were more positive about the NRM compared to NGO interviewees who were very critical of the NRM. The reason why officers were very positive of the NRM was, as they were saying, well, it secures the whereabouts of the victim. We know where they are. We know that they're getting some support, and we know where they are if we need them for our investigations. It gives stability to the victim. Therefore, they viewed the delays and the discrepancies in the NRM, which are faced by non-UK EU victims, as a result of practical difficulties in the investigation of cases. I remember a UK government official who was telling me, how are we supposed to investigate a case of a victim and find their perpetrators when the same victim has been trafficked through a number of countries and then through the Libya desert? On the other hand, NGO interviews were very concerned about the duration and the quality of the NRM support and the quality of the accommodation provisions. Another interesting juxtaposition between them were the stereotypes that they were adopting. So officers usually adopted narrow representations of organized, monetary-driven traffickers, and on the other hand, they were recognizing the existence of a spectrum for victims based on varying levels of prior knowledge and consent. Things flip here for NGO interviewees. They were more, let's say, stereotypical in how they viewed their victims as idealized, fully forced, fully deceived victims who never knew, suspected, or consented to anything. And at the same time, they were recognizing the existence of a spectrum for traffickers based on varying levels of organization, or because they frequently overlap with victims. I remember one of the NGO interviewees who was telling me that people think that traffickers are like the triads or the mafia. They're not as organized sometimes as we may think, and sometimes they were victims themselves beforehand. Interviews also revealed a new gray area for human trafficking, where the trafficker and the victim did agree on some nature of work and exploitation conditions, but these were subsequently and abruptly worsened by the trafficker. And I use the term contracted exploitation gone wrong to describe that. And then victimless prosecutions, another hip topic of the time, were found to be helpful by some interviewees. So victimless prosecution is basically a prosecution on a trafficking or slavery offense that doesn't involve the participation of the victim. And you try to pretty much follow the trail of money or other sort of evidence. Police officers who are burdened with the task of conducting investigations, which turn into prosecutions, were, however, concerned about the risks of removing the victim from the investigation process. A lot of people to defend victimless prosecutions were saying that, well, in murder case, we don't have a victim, and we still managed to solve quite a hefty deal of them, quite a hefty amount of murder cases. Why can we not do the same thing for trafficking cases? Well, a few police officers on that were quite forthright. They said, well, in a murder case, you don't have the victim by definition, but if we have it, if we have the victim with us, why not utilize their evidence, their services as much as we can? Why not collaborate with them? Why make our lives much, much harder? So victimless prosecutions is quite a hot topic as well. But moving past that to the story of Eve. So for anybody who wants to read more about Eve and her trafficking experience, I believe it's chapter 9 of my thesis. So Eve was a domestic female victim trafficked for prostitution in England for 10 years since the age of 13. So basically Eve was groomed by her traffickers at early teenage years, and then she was subsequently exploited in sex trafficking, in prostitution. Her experience overall pinpointed issues of misidentification and neglect for domestic victims in the UK, suggesting a narrowing down of the trafficking victim definition in police practice. So what happened in a way was that Eve was incorrectly labeled by police officers because she was trying to approach services and agencies and police bodies to sort of refer herself to them. And many police officers were actually saying, you're just a consenting prostitute, you're not a trafficking victim. And then she was referred once wrongly to a domestic abuse organization, which was so irrelevant to what she was experiencing that she basically cliff dropped from that and continued being trafficked. Again, I will pinpoint at the end on how you can read more about Eve's experience and her traumatic, let's say, experience that she had to undergo with her traffickers. If you read more about what she sort of had to endure, and cases where she had to undergo surgeries to remove, let's say, glass from her private parts, or she describes incidents being treated by her traffickers in very crude and sexually torturous way. In a way, she was complaining to them that I cannot service any more clients. And then as a crude joke, her traffickers were inserting batteries into her private parts, saying that you need to be charged up. So These are trigger warning again. These are some things that you can read more about in the thesis and her traumatic experience. But I think what is really important here is that there was a practical, in real life, narrowing down of the trafficking victim definition in police practice that was, to an extent, also caused by her domestic, let's say, status. So her traffickers profile. Unfortunately, the caseworker did not elaborate as much as I would have on the profile of Eve's traffickers. However, from her account, I can understand that they were somewhat organized, but on a lower local level, not so much national or transnational level. Eve was finally referred to the NRM, basically self-referred, and there she encountered a lack of tailored counseling and psychological support services. So what she said is, I only got 3 counseling meetings, and it was so prescriptive, I had to wait a queue. There were people before me and people after me, and it was only for 45 minutes. It was a short duration and support for her. And what she said is that domestic victims compared to non-UK, non-domestic ones are frequently neglected by the NRM. Now, if you read literature, if you read the work of scholars like Margaret Malloch, she uses that phrase limbo to describe the waiting period for asylum seekers or for human trafficking victims who come from abroad and are exploited in the UK and have to wait for months or even years for a final conclusive decision to be reached on their status. When Eve was asked that, she said, well, sure, they do wait for a long time, but at least they get some sort of support during that waiting period compared to domestic victims like myself, who only got the prescriptive 45 days and were basically just kicked off at the end of that, and off you go. And then a final thing here is the involvement of agencies not specialized in human trafficking. So what happens is that, well, in this case, the UK government contracts Salvation Army in England. Salvation Army will subcontract other organizations to provide support in certain locations. In Eve's case, in her location, there was an agency involved that took her under their wing and supported her that was not specialized in human trafficking. As Eve said, they were people who wanted to do good, but did not know how to support me in a way that is appropriate to my sort of problem, to my victim background. That led Eve to cliff drop and return to her traffickers. The caseworker did ask her to elaborate more on that period, but she didn't want to. And I think the positive thing is that after 10 years, Eve has completely cut ties with her traffickers, at least at the time of the interview. And she seemed to be fully socially reintegrated, which is obviously the positive thing for her. Now, conclusions, going into conclusions. The narrow policy-based representations of victims and traffickers and the goal of total trafficking elimination may result in unintended consequences and missed opportunities regarding identification of trafficking cases. The discrepancies in viewpoints among practitioners of different backgrounds shows the need for more communication and coordination, and that was very prominent specifically in Scotland. There were issues with first responder skills, consistency in practice, and also a need to increase trafficking awareness more widely. What some NGO interviewees said was that we don't come in contact with people in their daily lives. It's usually other professions like bank tellers or postmen or energy service providers who might send their representatives to homes and to do some sort of maintenance work, for instance, or advertising work. It's those people that get into contact with families and other people, and they should be better equipped to understand the signs that there might be human trafficking going on here. Firefighters were another profession that are, let's say, on the front line of dealing with a wide array of people. Now, the mixing of reserved and devolved powers is, to an extent, causing and reinforcing several of the NRM's inadequacies, and that does make the suggestion of drastic improvements a difficult task. As I said, a friendlier immigration policy towards victims can be a pull factor for trafficking cases, especially for those cases of victims who might be more active and have more of a say in their, let's say, futures or where they're going to go, and making Britain an even more welcoming destination for trafficking practices. If you are a more consenting victim, a more knowledgeable victim, and have some sort of a say in your future, having a country like the UK providing more for victims or referred victims might be a pull factor here. However, an NRM that would put more emphasis on support and reintegration mixed with a friendlier migration policy for survivors could draw more trafficking in the country, but may also empower and motivate victims to act as witnesses and bring more successes for criminal justice systems in the UK. Therefore, what I concluded is that policymaking on the matter is purely an issue of political perspective and political choice. Some recommendations, a bit of a selfish alert here. I would like to see an introduction of relevant research hubs within Scottish universities. With the exception of a couple of institutions in Scotland, there are universities where trafficking researchers might not know each other. They might be based in different schools and might have never heard of each other. There needs to be, again, a selfish alert here, more openness on the part of NGOs and criminal justice systems for researchers to gain easier access to victims and traffickers. I remember when I was presenting a few years ago, I had a question by a woman in the audience who asked me, well, you're not a trained psychologist, you're not a trained social worker, you're a lawyer. What makes you think you're suitable to speak to people who bear trauma? Well, she obviously hasn't met many lawyers and the confidence that they have, but that's not the issue here. I would say, in my opinion, and from what I understand from my, let's say, from my studies and from my experience, is that when you speak to someone else, and even if they're heavily traumatized, irrespective of whether you have a trained psychology or social work background, in your first discussion, you do not know what trigger warnings the other person has, what triggers they have. You find them through discussion. And sure, that discussion is informed. It does have steps. But at the end of the day, it's basic discussion that follows basic rules of respect and understanding. So there's no degree in the world that will make you suitable to speak to anyone. And you find what triggers a person, and you find what their let's say, their triggers are through discussion. So in this sense, I am a big advocate that we need to open up pathways to interview victims and convicted traffickers for researchers. For instance, Eve was brutally traumatized by male traffickers, but she was very eager to speak to someone. And especially someone who was not a counselor, who was not a psychologist, who was not there to treat her. But on the other hand, there was another female victim of sex trafficking that we had the opportunity to also interview for my thesis. And she was really eager as well. And the moment she heard that I'm a male researcher, she backed out of that completely. She said, no, sorry, because she was so brutally traumatized and brutalized by male traffickers herself as well, that she just didn't want to speak to a man. And then what I suggested was, like Eve, let's have an interview by proxy. We'll have a female caseworker, a female social worker speak to you, and you will never see me, you will never hear of me. And what she said was that you're still in the background, you're still the one benefiting from that, and you're a man. So what I'm trying to say is that there are sometimes triggers that are beyond the control of the researcher. Obviously, there was nothing I can do to change my sex, and you cannot predict these things. So you just roll with the punches, and it's very relevant, and it's very relative, and it depends upon the person, because trauma is experienced very differently. And biology plays a big role in how trauma is experienced very differently by people as well as structures. So for Scotland now, moving on to my next recommendation, I would suggest the introduction of an independent monitoring advisory body that would meet, let's say, bi-monthly and bring all stakeholders together. Someone could say, well, we have that, or we had that. That was CATRIS. I would say that CATRIS didn't take off maybe as much as some of us would have liked. And maybe the reason for that is that it needs to be more stakeholder driven, created by stakeholders to be more respected by stakeholders. And then a final recommendation, at least for this slide, would be central handling of the NRM's first stages. So basically, the identification of victims and their referral to NRM stages could be more centralized, could be more reserved, of course, with the collaboration of the Scottish and the Northern Irish governments. Because in my opinion, that would streamline things, that would smooth out the first stages. If we train first responders the same in a central way, then we make sure that we don't misidentify victims and we refer the right people to the right services, in this case, the NRM. Now, two final recommendations, I'm running out of time, is the first of all, the Scottish NRM. That was a big topic, especially brought up by NGOs in Scotland, who suggested that why don't we devolve the whole thing? Why do we devolve the Scottish NRM? In my opinion, that is unfeasible. And the reason for that is because there is a connection between human trafficking and migration. 3 out of 4 victims referred in the UK, potential victims of trafficking, are foreigners, and 1 out of 4 is domestic. Also, getting a positive, conclusive decision by the NRM that says you're a victim of trafficking and we recognize that is not giving you automatically a leave to remain or a VTS, as it's called now, a temporary permission to stay. However, it is the first barrier towards that. And from my discussions that I had with Scottish government officials and what I wrote in my PhD is that if you devolve the Scottish NRM, if you devolve the NRM to Scotland, it's like you're devolving borders and migration and devolving Scotland through the back door. Of course, if Scotland were to be independent, there needs to be a Scottish NRM. That said, there is a child trafficking devolved pilot going on, which I believe has recently finished, with the participation of Scotland as well. I don't think it's been properly assessed or evaluated yet, at least on a wide scale, to the best of my knowledge. So the jury's out on that one, but I would be really intrigued to see the results of that pilot. And then final recommendation would be potential extension of the support offered to victims in Scotland, particularly following a positive conclusive decision obtained by the NRM in line with Section 9 of the Human Trafficking Scotland Act. And of course, as this power has been reduced by the enactment of the Illegal Migration Act, I would suggest consultation of Section 2 and Section 22 to 24 of the Illegal Migration Act 23. And there you'll see that the powers conferred upon the Scottish ministers are significantly reduced, but still within these powers, there is a potential to extend the support offered to victims in Scotland. So this is the end of my presentation. Thanks to everyone for attending. Thanks to Niall, my mentor for SJF, for chairing that. And also, just to say, before we move to the Q&A and the discussion part, this is another chance for you to scan the QR code, which will take you to the page where the policy brief is published and where the podcast episode is also, if you scroll further down. And hopefully that was a good webinar. So back to you, Niall.
Okay. Thank you very much, Konstantinos. Do you want to pop that down in due course? Now, this being Zoom, whether or not people can raise their hands is always going to be a subject of an uncertainty, should we say. So if people want to ask a question, they can raise their hand, but equally they can just pop something in the meeting chat. Would probably be the easiest rather than using the formal Q&A, and or they can just pipe up as well, is absolutely fine. And people can sort of raise their questions that way. I mean, I'll start with one. I mean, to what extent, Konstantinos, do you think, I mean, the broadening out of the trafficking definitions become so broad now to some extent? Is there any virtue still in having almost a separate concept of trafficking versus just considering it more broadly in terms of exploitation?
I would say there is a scope for having a separate human trafficking definition. I think the fact that the trafficking definition is very wide and very encompassing is not necessarily a bad thing. I think it's actually, to an extent, a good thing. Exactly because at the end of the day, these are people who are vulnerable. These are people who usually come from quite deprived settings. And the idea of human trafficking, or the idea of modern slavery or slavery in general, is that it sort of strips you off of any choice. It strips you off of the ability to sort of decide for yourself and make the best for yourself. And that's the reason why the trafficking definition is so wide. In my thesis, I tried to explain, again, that's very theoretical. In my thesis, I tried to explain what was the transformative change, the transformative power that led us to criminalize trafficking as slavery. And as I said there, and the understanding that I have is that Christianity was the basic thing why we abolished slavery, why we criminalized basically human trafficking and modern slavery, or slavery at the time, let's say in the 19th century. It was because of the focus of Christianity on the idea of the infinite I, and the idea of I have a free choice to dispose myself as I want to and make the decision that I want for myself. Christianity is a highly, let's say, to an extent, individualist theory. And through individualism, you get your collectivity. So the moment that you cannot decide freely for yourself because you come from a background of vulnerabilities, and the moment you're not free because you've been threatened or deceived or forced, or you're afraid, or someone has abused the position of trust and power that they have towards you, then that is unacceptable for people, at least who espouse that philosophy. So I think having a human trafficking definition and a human trafficking offense is really valuable. However, I do think that there needs to be a discussion and a delineation of what is human trafficking and what is consenting prostitution, and whether we want to have consenting prostitution, because there are countries that say that we don't want to have consenting prostitution and we criminalize everything when it comes to prostitution. And there are other countries that say that we want to have regulated consenting prostitution. It's a big discussion on whether legislation that allows consenting prostitution, like the one, let's say, in the Netherlands, whether that also correspondingly increases human trafficking or decreases that, or it brings the industry to light, as some people say. I think this is a very big discussion, and there's good views and good, I would say, ideas and arguments on both sides.
Yeah, that's a good answer. Thank you, Konstantinos. And we have an observation, but it may also be a question from Marianne. As a social worker, I really totally get we want to protect the people we work with from emotional harm, but as a researcher, I have been humbled by the need to also facilitate people to have their voices and stories heard. Taking part in research can be incredibly empowering for people, and many want to actively be involved in informing policy around that. Yeah, so that's sort of reinforcing your point around.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that. I mean, I'm not saying that NGO workers are gatekeeping for a bad purpose, or because they don't like researchers or something like that. They do that out of good faith. They do that out of good volition. But I'm just saying there needs to be a bit more openness on that part. But I definitely understand how reserved they might be in terms of opening the doors to researchers. I would like to see more active research with traffickers as well, and of course victims. But I definitely understand reservations, whether they come from the prison service or whether they come from NGOs. I definitely hear that, but there needs to be a sort of a more good faith discussion around that.
Yeah, and I guess victims need to be part of the conversation around their own gatekeepering as well, rather than being done on their behalf.
That runs the risk of patronizing someone. I think some people want to speak and some people do not want to speak, and I think we should first of all, in a way, it also gives power and voice. What Marianne says, it gives power and voice to survivors to say, well, there's this piece of research going on, maybe you fit. It doesn't bear any consequences whether you say yes or no. It's up to you. Some people find that cathartic. Some people find just having a listening platform is very cathartic.
Yeah, that's a good point. And we have a question from Steve, who's probably going to give you a challenging question, I suspect. So,
as he always does.
Yeah, he's arguing, as he always does, indeed, in favour of removing asylum applicants to Rwanda for processing on the basis of disrupting human traffickers. What can you say about the relationship between asylum and human trafficking policy, and the impact on victims of human trafficking?
Yeah, that's a bit of a faff there, the policies. Whether any boats to Rwanda or any flights to Rwanda, to be more precise, whether that takes place, that's a big question. As Steve has taught me as well, what policy says and what policy does are two very different things. So you can understand from his question, 3.5 years supervision, I had this very mind-cracking questions. I would say, honestly, the removing asylum seekers or potential asylum seekers, my understanding, the people who are going to be removed to Rwanda are people who might not have succeeded in the asylum claims, but I'm not entirely sure on that. It's a big discussion. It's a big discussion for what is an asylum seeker and who is an asylum seeker. I'm a person that advocates that you're an asylum seeker, and that might be controversial or not. You're an asylum seeker in the first safe country you encounter, and that's it. That's my opinion. That's my interpretation of Article 31, if I remember well, of the Refugee Convention. That's my understanding from reading it, from the letter of the law. That's the interpretation that at least the Illegal Migration Act is adopting clearly on Section 2. I think it was Swella Braverman who did that, who took that. That's the interpretation that they're following, which makes pretty much most people who arrive in a country cut off from any places where torture is taking place, where persecution is taking place, and that country is the UK. The UK is very cut off from places of the world where you have reasons for people to be refugees and leave those countries, flee those countries. So that makes virtually the UK an asylum seeker free country in a way. That's what the aim of the legislation is. I mean, let's be honest. Whether that's going to affect human trafficking or not is another topic. There's definitely a correlation between asylum seekers and human trafficking victims. Not necessarily, but there is sometimes an overlap between the two identities. You might be fleeing persecution, and in the course of that, meet people who've promised some sort of better future and end up exploiting you. And obviously you were vulnerable, and obviously they were abusing whatever position of power and trust they had towards you. There's an overlap there. It's clear that the Illegal Migration Act it will be enacted in relation to human trafficking victims as well. As I said, Section 2 and Sections 20-24 say that. I think what the UK government did at that point, and there may be or may not be a change in government soon anyway, is that we prioritize borders and immigration more than we prioritize treating, caring for human trafficking victims or survivors. That is not something that I would assign a positive or a negative value. I would assign, as I said, it's all a matter of political perspective and choice. And usually, and it tends to be parties who tend to be on the right, they tend to prioritize migration. They tend to move by the Roman proverb that I wrote in my thesis as well, salus populi suprema lex est, the welfare of the people of the country is the supreme law of that country. Whether I'm personally in favor or opposed to that, I think there are vulnerable people who will be left out, who will not be able to enter the UK and potentially get the services that they need. At the same time, maybe if that's enforced on a wider scale in destination countries, that cuts off routes, trafficking routes, and that stops to an extent, or reduces, to be more precise, the trafficking problem. Then obviously these people will be trafficked within their own countries or within other countries who were not destination states previously, but they might become now, even though they might be poorer than the classic destination states we have now. And sure, that's a problem, but I'm always a big advocate of you solve those problems on a national scale. So I think it takes a bit of effort from origin, transit, destination states to reduce the routes of trafficking. And I think the UK is following a way to do that. It's interesting if others were following that, if just the UK is doing that, that may not be enough. And it would be interesting to see origin states doing that. It would be interesting for all states to assume their responsibilities in this game, in this situation, I would say. That's a very long answer to a very long question.
It's a difficult question. I mean, just in relation, see, give people a chance if there's any other questions, but how would you, if for anybody with a policy and practice background here, let's assume there's a change of government, but the Illegal Immigration Act is not immediately repealed, or the Section 2 and Section 20 are still in force. How would you practically see that interacting with the NRM and current provision in terms of the experience?
Yeah, I think what a party promises before they get up to power and what they do when they get that power in their hands is very different. So it's up to, I mean, let's not hide ourselves. It's probably Labour who's going to win it. It looks like it's going to be a landslide. And what they say and what they do is going to be very interesting. And the juxtaposition between the two. It's not Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn. It's Labour Party under the most center-right wing politician the Labour Party probably has under their wing, who's Keir Starmer. He's more of a left-wing conservative, right-wing Labour Party kind of politician, right? So what they do, I don't think they're going to change it much. I don't think they're going to repeal it much. They might repeal some facade of it, or they might not repeal it at all. I think in terms of, well, the goal is to reduce flows. I cannot predict if that's going to reduce flows or not, but that's definitely the goal. Is migration the problem of the UK? I don't know. I always tend to ask lay people around me, and for quite a lot of lay people around me who are non-academics but live, let's say, in an everyday life outside of the ivory tower of academia, that I like to say, for a lot of people, it is a big issue. It is one of the top 3-4 issues there. I think it's going to reduce some flows, and I think that's definitely the goal. How it goes on the long run, it depends on how much you enforce and you respect and you believe that piece of legislation. If you don't, then it's going to be an empty letter. If you do, it might have some benefits.
Cool. So do we have, because I'm aware we're up to the hour, and I'm wondering if we have any other questions. People can either shout them out or they can raise their hands. And otherwise people have the material, the QR code to scan and absorb, because there's a lot to absorb and there's quite a lot of complexity in the material as well. I mean, it's just one final. I mean, total elimination. I quite agree with you. I mean, there's sort of there's the rhetoric of it, and yeah, you're right. We apply it to all crime-based issues, but is it a little more of a problem than that in the case of human trafficking? The framing of it in terms of elimination individualizes it to the offender and the choices of offenders, and ignores the structural and systemic issues. And this is a particular area where I think in Scotland we can do more about. We can't do much about choices around migration and borders necessarily, but we can do much about exploitative sectors and employment in particular, given that employment is the major form of exploitation. Labour exploitation is the major form of exploitation. So elimination keeps the focus on the offender and the blaming of offenders, rather than actually maybe reflecting more broadly on systems and structures.
I think it does, yeah, and it gives like a very policing perspective to everything. It just says we're going to police that and it will go away. I know what you mean. It doesn't it doesn't sort of address the underlying problems and factors that fuel human trafficking. And to an extent, this is poverty, deprivation, unemployment, juxtaposition of no opportunities to many more opportunities between origin and destination states. And these are factors that are not going to be addressed by the purpose of the goal of elimination. There is a discussion about what destination states can do to improve origin states situation, and is that their responsibility? It's a big discussion to be had. It's a very big discussion to be had. I'm a big advocate of, as I said, realism in international relations. I'm always saying that every nation should strive to do the best for themselves. And I think that's the end of that's my argument there. And if it's up to the destination states to have a mixture of, policing perspective, but also some sort of supporting and caring mechanisms there. I think the elimination goal is just a way to toughen up things. I always think elimination is just a way to toughen up things. Whatever you may enforce, it's a way to for government overreach, whether that is in borders, whether that is in taxation, whether that is in pretty much everything, restricting movements and things like that. I just take offense in that because it doesn't frame things very well. It just frames things in a way that, in a very movie sort of way, we can do that and we'll solve the case. It's not like that. It's not like a 2-hour movie when you get a horrible crime and then in 2 hours you've apprehended the whole organized crime ring or the killers or anything. I think it's much more complex than that, and such discourses, they sort of make the whole issue just cheaper and just like they oversimplify that. That's the offense I take, and I think we can do better at phrasing things there with policies, and we can do that definitely more succinctly. Someone's going to say, what are you going to say then? Just regulate human trafficking, reduce human trafficking? Well, let's start by understanding human trafficking, right? We don't understand human trafficking to a very large extent. Let's start about from that, understanding human trafficking, and then see what we can do about it.
Yeah, that's a good answer. And I think we've done a very good job of unsimplifying human trafficking in the last hour, which is sort of what you want to be doing to some extent. So that's been useful and certainly beneficial for me. So let's just see, are there any final questions? It's your last chance, everybody. If there's any questions, other than that, it just really leaves us to thank Konstantinos very much for a really stimulating sort of lunch hour. It's given me lots of food for thought. Be interesting to see how policy adapts and changes. I don't think it'll be immediately irrespective of any general election result.
Yeah, sure.
But it'll be good to see what the immediate policy responses are to in the post-election environment. So thank you very much again to Konstantinos. Thank you to Rachel for organising the event, and for Julie, of course, as the lead of SCCJR for sponsoring. It's been a really stimulating hour, and thank you to everybody for attending. So I hope everybody gives them food for thought. Do go and look at the publication. It's really interesting. It's very challenging to produce these sorts of publications, so it'd be interesting to get people's reflections on it as well.
I was just going to say, yeah, if you follow the Scottish, if you go to the policy brief and then you go into the references, you might get you'll get a list of my full publications, including my thesis. So that's the way to find everything through the SCCJR policy brief PDF. Yeah, it's
all there. So thank you everybody for attending. Everybody thanks to Konstantinos, and everybody have a lovely rest of your Friday. So take care.
Thank you.